back to another amazing episode of the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. I am your host, Ben Pakulski. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today's guest is Dr. Andy Galpin, and no muscle building and performance conversation would be complete without this gentleman. His contribution to research over the last 10 years has been nothing short of remarkable and ultimately game-changing. Andy takes a very open-minded skeptic approach to his research and his thought process. He's currently coaching some of the top athletes in the world, from the Major League Baseball to National Hockey League to UFC and so well beyond that. Andy is exploring the realms of possibility, the outskirts of performance. And what that means to me is somebody who's thinking outside the box. Instead of following common dialogue and just simply doing what everyone else is doing, Andy's looking for ways to really push the frontiers of what's possible in human performance. And that's what makes this conversation such a great one. Andy Galpin is a professor at UC Fullerton and just an amazing, amazing human. He's a dad. He's a passionate man who just truly loves what he does. And it's really a gift to have Andy join us today yet again on the podcast. He's one of my favorite guests. This is his third time returning. Andy and I have had some great conversations, and this one is nothing short. Today's podcast is brought to you by our amazing friends over at BiOptimizers. They have another special offer for you today, so listen close. MagBreakthrough.com/muscle intelligence is going to get you 10% off and free shipping. So you're going to save a bunch of cash when you head over to magbreakthrough.com/muscle intelligence. Use the code muscle10 for 10% off at least. Some other things are going to give you more, and you're going to get free shipping right now when you take action and pick up Magnesium Breakthrough. Why should you pick up Magnesium Breakthrough? Because stress is a big, big part of our current society. And magnesium tends to be the mineral that we burn through fastest when we're stressed. So whether you're training hard, whether you're stressed from work, whether you're just stressed from life, magnesium tends to be the mineral that most people are deficient in because it's so prevalent in so many different processes. So again, that's Mag Breakthrough, MagBreakthrough.com/muscle intelligence to get hooked up with 10% off your order and free shipping. So don't miss out, guys. And enjoy the show with Dr. Andy Galpin. When we're looking at optimization of an athlete, and we've removed the biochemical component, which I know you work together closely with our friend, and we could say his name or not, your call, Dr. Dan Garner, and he's doing the biochemical side. So he's doing the blood, the urine, the microbiome, and all the internal metrics, and you're optimizing the athlete from another side. And that is so fascinating to me because these are the things, like, most people don't get biochemistry, and that's kind of Dan's space. And most people also don't get how to optimize the physiological outcomes that they're trying to achieve with an athlete. And you might be one of the best guys in the world now, and certainly are one of the best guys in the world. So I'd love to look, like, if we were to start high level and say, okay, someone walks into your life and we want to start high level and say, what are all the things we're looking at? Where do you start?
Yep. So the way that we think about this is, everything rolls under this umbrella that we call our biomolecular athlete. And we're trying to take this DNA all the way to human performance picture. We want to print a biomolecular portrait of this individual. And so we can optimize without, I hate that word, but we can get as close to what we call their true physiological potential as we possibly can. So in order to do that, we have to take a little bit of a step back from, say, just worrying about a particular hormone or enzyme, and understand what it really means to be a human being. And that task is impossible. It's thousands and thousands of metrics, but we've spent a bit of time and used a lot of experience with high-level performers and boiled it down to a handful of things. And so really what we do in our diagnostics is just that. So we use a variety of laboratory-based techniques. We use everything from questionnaires to some basic tracking, to some other objective scans and metrics. And we truly try to capture this true physiological potential. And then we break them down into a couple of categories. And once I lay these categories out, I can show you Dan's piece, and then we can, put that fact, you have to go back a few episodes and listen to Dan talk about that side. And then we'll focus on the other sides. So really the three main categories, we call these hidden stressors, visible stressors, and then recovery capacity. Now, the visible stressors we can talk a lot about today, but those are the things we call them visible because you tend to be somewhat aware of them. You can see them, you can feel them, they affect you today, typically acutely and chronically. Just a really easy example of that is your body composition, right? So you can look down at yourself and realize, geez, I need to lose some weight, or I'm too thin, or whatever. You're going to see and feel these things. The next category was what we call hidden stressors. So sometimes these are symptomatic, and the gut microbiome is a good example of this. So sometimes people know they have gut issues, but sometimes they don't, right? So these can be hidden stressors. You don't necessarily know that you're a little bit deficient in B5. You may not know that your copper is a little high. You may feel some symptoms, but you're not going to have a direct, like, oh my gosh, I drank too much booze last night. I feel terrible. That is a visible stressor, right? You know you're smoking too much. You know you're not working out or whatever. So Dan handles a lot of the hidden stressors. And that's when your saliva and stool and sweat samples and everything else come in. And then your recovery capacity. And so the way that we think about it is adaptability. So your ability to make progress and change over time is a function of your total stress load and your recovery capacity. And so the amount of total stressors someone can take is different because it's also a function of the recovery capacity. So someone with a very high recovery capacity could handle more total stressors, and someone in the opposite scenario would be struggling or somewhere in between. So we're trying to capture all that stuff in the most objective and subjective factors possible. And once we do that, then that's how we paint this portrait. And then we can come in and give the individual, the high performer, a snapshot and say, hey, these are the categories that are probably going to move the biggest lever with you, right? So these are what we call severe performance anchors. So these are things that are, think about dragging your ship from behind. And it's just like you're trying and you're rowing and you're rowing and you're rowing, but it just feels like you're rowing uphill. You're just not getting anywhere. And that's not because you're not moving and doing the right things, but it's because some big ass anchor is dragging you underneath the water that you don't even realize. So all we really have to do is remove that anchor and the ship sails. So the last analogy I'll do here, and then I'll pause, is kind of imagine that you're driving a car downhill and you're like, hey, Andy, I want to go faster. I say, okay, well, you have two possible options. One, you can remove the brakes, or you can hit the accelerator. Well, what most people talk about and what they want to jump to is hitting the accelerator. So you want to hit the gas because your assumption is I hit the gas, I go faster. But if your foot's smashed down on the brake, the only thing that happens when you hit the gas is you might go a little faster, but you're also probably going to burn your motor or something's going to blow. And so what we're really trying to figure out is your foot on the pedal? Is it all the way down to the floor? Is it kind of down? Is it 5% down? If so, we want to remove that anchor. Remove your foot off the brake because you'll just start going way faster by just removing your foot off the brake. If that's still not enough, and we can start getting some really fancy stuff to speed up the process and go faster. But in order to avoid you blowing to pieces and getting your actual results, getting to your destination faster, we got to look at both sides of the equation. So that's the big picture of what we do with our biomolecular athlete program.
I think that's like literally the perfect metaphor, right? Most guys are rolling around with their emergency brake on and trying to hit the gas pedal, and they're just not going anywhere. And they're revving the engine, they're burning hot, and they're not sure what's going on, and they're spinning their wheels. That's literally the perfect metaphor. So what are the typical things that you're working on to start removing those brakes? I know we talked about a few before we started recording, but maybe you have a list of things that are typical.
Yep. So as I started to, we have to understand physiology is it's a stepward progression from complexity. So if you start at your DNA, DNA then goes in to make molecules, and molecules make cells. Cells make tissue. Tissue make organs. Organs make organ systems, and that's you. Okay, fantastic. Well, what we have to do is try to capture where are your brakes being applied. So if we go all the way down to the bottom and we look at the DNA and your genes, there are potential brakes that could be happening there. So various DNA polymorphisms and everything else. Well, I can't change you there. So we might look at that especially if we have some indication that something's going on. But for the most part, we don't spend a lot of energy there because you can't do shit about it, right? This is not something that's a huge deal. So same thing, kind of as you move from the molecule all the way up, it's tough to change. So we really try to spend our attention on what are the things that are the easiest to change that have the biggest impact. So from the visible stressor side, a big category is emotional and psychological processing. And so we are certainly not experts in that. We don't deal with PTSD or trauma or things like that. But there are some evidence-based, science-based questionnaires you can use. And there are some other ones that I have borrowed from world-leading sports psychologists. And we run folks through these questionnaires. And if we see anything pop up, then we're going to push them, whether it be to a sports psychologist or a therapist, or I even had one individual just this week, professional athlete, who it's one of the first people I've identified in our group that I said, I think you are really a strong candidate for psychedelic, physical, psychedelic. Yeah, absolutely.
What made that stand out to you? Like, what was what was it about them?
Yeah, it was actually a combination of a lot of things, but it was extreme trauma in an area in which I don't think many humans could understand or sympathize with. It was some long, and it was I'd say it's a cycle, but the physiology was good. And so once the physiology is there to support it, it's like, I think you need just something that'll smack you in the face. And it's just like, we need a perspective change. We need a shift change, a really hard, really aggressive shift change. And I think that's going to be combined then, of course, with ongoing work with a professional. That's different than someone who's been depressed their whole life and just dealt with kind of all of these things. Like, you just have a lot of work I think you have to do. I'm out of my area here, but this individual is just like, hey, you just had some really crazy shit happen. We're kind of in a spiral right now. I think we should just hit the brakes. It just pop out of the system. I think that's going to be really helpful. There's more to it than that, but I'm trying to say as top level as I can there. So that's one part of it. And I started there because that's not our area of interest. I think we can have more conversation about the area that I'm more versed in. So outside of that, we're looking for things like physical stress. This is basic training program. Is it appropriate? Is it well-rounded? Is it hitting all the physiological needs that you need to participate in your sport, as well as to have an appropriate physiology? Hydration. So there's some really cool tech that we have that we can really real-time data on hydration content as well. So are we optimizing? In fact, we had this week with an individual who's the number one player in the world in his sport. And we just changed some salt things on the day of competition, and just the physiology numbers just took off and performance took off. So that is a big thing you can play with. And it's just one of those topics that people are just like, oh yeah, drink more water. And everyone says it, but then no one really talks about what specifically to do. And then no one executes it. So it's a huge lever if you actually do the shit. You do it right. You don't just just drink water. And then from there, it's diet quality. Exactly. Like, we don't guess. The folks I work with, we do not have time to guess, not to guess. And then the last one in the big category is, of course, sleep. And the way that I can say it is, there's infinite sleep technology right now that'll tell you how you're sleeping, how many hours you slept, and it'll give you all these readiness scores and HRV. But our tech is the only thing in the world that'll show you why you're sleeping that way. And so it's the most well-rounded, scientifically advanced, comprehensive sleep diagnostics that's available in the world. And so that has just been an absolute game changer for our folks, because it regulates so much physiology.
So let's talk about that, because you seem very excited about that, and sleep is massive for everyone. So I'd love to talk about the approach and maybe talk about the tech.
Yep, sure. If you take something that like a classic wearable, some of these are good and some are bad. Aura is a good example. They've just released their V3, and the previous versions were okay for things, pretty good for things like total sleep and the time you went to sleep and the time you woke up and things like that. But they were not holding up scientifically for the sleep stages. So you couldn't trust, how many minutes of REM or deep sleep you were getting off of an Oura ring before. Now the claim is with their new V3, they've changed their algorithms, and that's better. And it honestly looks to be that case so far, but we'll have to wait for the studies to come out to confirm that. So what happens is they've got to match that up against full sleep study, what we call PSG, so polysomnography, actual EEG signals in your brain and things like that, and it's got to be a separate organization. But let's say it works, because actually the numbers we've got on our athletes, they look better now. Well, that's great. The downside about any of that sleep tech, though, and the reason I'm saying more is because I generally do like it, actually. So I'm using this as support, not as a criticism, relative to almost everything else in the market for a bunch of reasons. Whoop has some benefits too, but the issue though is it's telling you slept like shit. Okay, then what do I do about it? Sleep more. Well, that's great. Like maybe I can't because of my schedule, or two, like I'm fucking trying, asshole, but like I can't. So it's not particularly helpful. What we have done is built something that is more comprehensive. So number one, if you look at why someone sleeps the way they sleep, it's a function of physiology. So what are your serotonin levels like? What are your melatonin levels like? What is your cortisol at different stages at night? So we've got to have a full comprehensive physiological analysis of that side of your life. And so we have built that out. So now we can do this with individuals. We can track them. Kits we send to their house, and we get saliva and urine and blood, and we actually get a full physiological picture. And so we can check in or check out that this is a basic physiology problem. So you can lay there in bed all you want. You can take a cold shower. You can do all these things that I love, and you can listen to my good friend Andrew Huberman, and he can tell you about doing yoga nidra and all this, but it's not going to matter if you're, and I can say this, we have had, I don't know, 10% of the professional athletes in the last 5 months have come back with melatonin levels that are, 20 to 100x the upper end of the reference range.
Is that from supplementation?
So they're taking what they think is 3 to 5 milligrams of melatonin, which is a very standard, even low dose. Some folks will say 10 milligrams, some will do 15, which is kind of high. But the research is going to tell you 3 milligrams is the same as 10. So there's no real need to exceed 3 to 5 milligrams. So they take that. Well, what they're actually not realizing, and said this has been shown scientifically, is the melatonin concentrations in your supplements can actually be 5 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 times actually what's labeled on the supplement. So these individuals are thinking they're popping 3 milligrams of melatonin at night, and the half-life of melatonin is typically like 60 to 90 minutes, which means half of it is metabolized, in the first hour or so. So it should be gone by the morning. But when you're taking concentrations that are multitudes and orders of magnitude more than you think, that half-life just is not enough. And so it just begins to build and build and build. And so they wake up sedated, effectively. They use more stimulants. They go to more caffeine. They go to more nicotine. They go to things like nootropics. And they're like, oh, my energy's great. I feel fine. But then they get to bed at night and they can't sleep. And so it's more melatonin. And we have fixed so many sleep problems by simply removing the melatonin and getting that shit the hell out of the system. And all of a sudden, they totally feel normal, and very quickly they feel incredible. If we can then get them off the stimulants or onto an appropriate stimulant plan, and there's some quick ways you can figure this out. So basically do something like this. If you like coffee or stimulants, fine, right? I don't have an issue with them. I don't like them personally, but scientifically, I'm totally fine with them. And they are quite effective performance aid, right? So the research is strong there, right? So cool, I'm fine with it. If you can't function well, though, in the first 90 minutes of your day without caffeine, that's a very good indicator of something that's off physiologically. So I say, okay, fine, you can have as much coffee as you want, but you got to wait 2 hours. And they're like, what? And then what they'll typically find is after 30 minutes or so, they start to actually kind of wake up, and then they realize they don't need 6 cups in the morning to get going. Like 1 is totally fine.
Right.
So you can do like very quick diagnostics like that and realize. So that's one of our things is we're going to figure out this actual physiology side and check in or check out. When we see these mega melatonin doses, we just stay right there, right? Where it's like, we just got to correct your physiology, and this alone is going to be there. But let's say their physiology looked great. Cortisol was appropriate, and DHEA looked appropriate, and everything looked fine or close, right? No major red flags there. Then we're going to go on to the next level, which is, are you simply giving yourself a lifestyle that enables you to do that. So in other words, are you getting home at midnight and then waking up at 6 a.m.? Well, like it doesn't matter how good you are. You don't have an actual window that allows it. And so we'll work on what we'll call a quadrant, which is prioritizing your 4 areas, which is your business or work or whatever you want to call it. Number 1, your physical, whatever you want to call that, working out, exercise, walking stuff, your relationships, and whatever that is, means to you. And then the last one is your recovery. So if you're hedged, and you get 10 points to spread across all 4 categories, if you're spending 9 out of 10 points on business, well, then you have literally no points on family or spirituality or whatever that stuff is. So we try to get them into an appropriate quadrant snapshot model where you actually have a shot. So let's say they check off there, because that's not a super interesting. It's a very, very effective, very effective, but it's not like super interesting for a podcast to listen. Let's say your lifestyle is great. Your physiology is amazing. Then we need to go into what's your sleep hygiene. And people have talked about this ad nauseum, so I don't want to spend a ton of time here. But this is your mattress cold? Is it dark? Et cetera, et cetera. Are you, working and then shutting your phone? Like all these things people have talked about, like don't do this shit before bed, don't do this,
right?
Whatever. Cool. Let's say all that checks off. Well, the last thing we can check off is environment. And this is what nobody has any chance to catch up to us on. So we have a sensor that we can place it on next to your bed. And this runs full environmental diagnostics. Yep. So we're looking at the amount of light in your bedroom as well as the melanopic lux, which is a specific wavelength that activates the melanopic cells. Think of this as like the blue light thing, right? Yep. We're looking at volatile organic acids. So these are things that are coming out of like your mattress that are floating out and being excreted. They're moving around. We're looking at, of course, temperature. We're looking at the sound pulse and how much true sound is coming in your room. It's looking at humidity. We have a metric of what's called your CO2 cloud. So as you lay there in bed, you're breathing out, and you're breathing out CO2. Well, you're not ventilating very hard, right? You're not going so you're breathing very lightly. So the CO2 just kind of leaks out of your mouth and stays right around your face. Well, anyone who's ever, had hyperventilated, and you're like, okay, put the brown bag kind of on your face. Well, the reason you do that is because you're breathing right back the CO2, right? So when you breathe back CO2 into we're wearing a mask, right? Like people have talked about that ad nauseum. What happens when you rebreathe your own CO2, right? Well, this is very problematic for sleep because you're going to be shooting awake. It's going to knock you out of certain sleep stages that we want to be in, is to simplify it. So we can measure that CO2 cloud around your face and head, and we can make sure that the environment is optimized and that stuff is moving and not staying around your face. And a whole host of other environmental factors that we can take a look at and measure. In addition, this thing has a full PSG system on. So it's taking full EEG scans of your brain. It's taking full measure of O2 saturation in your body. It's looking at movement. We can see within a millimeter change of your chest. So if your ventilation, if you really start to breathe hard, the chest will actually move up and down. And it can do this on every individual body position. So when you're on your back, when you're on your right side, when you're on your left side. And a good example of this is we had an individual professional athlete fairly recently who was having like 280 of what are called episodes, hypoapneas and some other things. So in order for this to be called an episode, it has to meet 4 specific criteria. Be a certain amount of physical movement, a certain amount of drop in oxygen saturation, a certain amount of change in EEG waves, and some other things. So he had almost 280 of these episodes that met all 4 criteria throughout the night, which if you break the math down, that means he was having these sleep episodes about every 2 minutes his entire night. Well, we actually found out that like 80% of those were just simply when he laid on his back. And so we put a little device in his, basically a little belt kind of thing. And by a couple of nights in, he was 90% reduction in sleep episodes by simply moving him on his physical side. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that we corrected over time. And now he doesn't have to wear that belt, and he has over double improvement in in PSG sleep quality in episodes because he had some physiology to correct as well by simply doing all that stuff. So that's the type of stuff that we can do with rest. And it gets even like, that's the at-home version. If you want, I could tell you about the real version of these, where you have basically an entire handcrafted optimal sleep environment in your entire bedroom. It's full biosensored, it's full AI equipped. It learns your physiology and adjusts everything along the way. So
what does this thing look like, man? That's the question. And maybe what does it cost? That may be too far of a stretch, but like, what does it look like? Is this something that an average person can have in their house?
Yeah. There's the box you can.
Well, let's talk about it, man. I want to learn all about it. So there's so many things to unpack there that I want to get into, but yeah, what is it just in general? Like, is this currently available for purchase, or like is this something you guys are coming out with? Or tell me about it.
Yeah, I have my box. Like we're here. So I asked you at the beginning. I said, "When's this going to go out?" Because you got to push it back. But yeah, we have the boxes. We've run a lot of quality control and validity stuff. They're ready to go. Like price, I can't say specifically yet because by the time this comes out, it'll change. It's not on the same wavelength as like Aura. It's not a couple $100,
right?
Because we're running full labs, all those things. The box itself is not that bad, but if you want the full sleep diagnostic, that's more. And then there's kind of different models. So like if you're a practitioner and you want to do this with all your clients, there's a way that we can like get this into you, and then you can kind of bring it back and forth and do things like that. So there's a bunch of different models.
Man, I think if you can correct, so I work with high level athletes and entrepreneurs like you, man. And if I can correct their sleep, everything else gets bumped up, right? The needle moves significantly.
Yeah.
So sign me up.
This all comes with actual work with a true sleep scientist as well. So not only are you going to get this stuff, but then you're going to get consults with a sleep scientist that runs through the actual data and verifies, double checks, and it's not just an algorithm that's going to kick things out. So
yeah,
that's the version. And if you want to get really nuts, though, we can come into your bedroom, wherever you want, master bedroom, whatever you want to do, and run the entire system on that, and then build the entire room to be an optimized sleep chamber. So this is everything from, let's say you walk in, and it says, "All right, Ben, what time do you need to get up tomorrow?" You're like, 6:30. Cool. Well, 12 to 14 hours before, it's going to start putting you through a progression of sound, light, and temperature to start prepping you for an ideal sleep situation that's going to back calculate based on your time. So you can't just walk into the room 7 hours before and then it's going to jar you awake or whatever. It's going to start walking you through cadence. And it can do that. Again, the AI and everything is built into the room.
This is one step away from Neuralink, man. This is like one step away from being plugged into the machine.
Or you can build it by the entire building if you want. And this is a drop. Basically, it's a pickup drop trailer that we could put anywhere. And the entire thing, front door to your bedroom, has been custom optimized for maximal sleep exposure.
I love it, man. So one thing
those are being built now, by the way.
That's amazing. So I want to get into it. So one of the things you said in there as you're going through the physiological parameters is a CO2 cloud. I'd never heard it stated that way before. That makes a lot of sense. You're a CO2, expert. We'll say breathing expert, CO2 expert. So I had never thought. Have you explored the possibility? And I think I know the answer, but have you explored the possibility of how this is directly implicating someone's stress perception? Right. So if they're rebreathing the CO2, is that effectively what's happening? The body's giving stress, driving up the heart rate, waking them up?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we've actually run a study in our lab, and this is in the peer review process. It's been admittedly in that process for quite some time. This is how science works sometimes. Things just kind of fall down prior to this. But yeah, so running a basic CO2 tolerance test is a reasonably decent predictor of one's state and trait anxiety. So state and trait, the difference is there is how much anxiety you're experiencing in this exact current moment, as well as just how much anxiety in general you are. It is not a 99% prediction or anything like that, but you can certainly differentiate, boy, I'm really smoked today. Another professional athlete, this is very, very high level. Like everyone in the world would know this person's name, no question. This individual was probably had a CO2 tolerance, what I would classify as poor, not like horrific, but poor. And after it probably took 8 months.
So what number is that? Give me an idea with the
30 seconds.
Yep.
Not great. Like,
yep.
Now we're routinely over 60 seconds.
Yep.
And then doubled, right? That's a really good example of, if he goes from 60 to 80, it's probably not doing much. But when he was at 30, it was a problem. Now, I've had another, this is a Major League Baseball player, last week test, and that person was at 6 seconds. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
That is, like, you're talking extreme anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So the difference between someone scoring 32 and 38 is probably the same thing. I would even say maybe 30 to 40 or 50 to whatever, 10 is. But when you have someone who is under 10 seconds, under 20 seconds, and I was actually asking my friend Rob Wilson about this from Art of Breath, and I was like, dude, under 10 seconds, have you heard of this? And he's like, oh yeah. And he's telling me more. I'm like, holy shit, this is really bad. And he's like, yeah, this is a big problem. So yeah, it does. It's not the only indicator, but think about it this way. When you exercise, the primary byproduct is 3 things, cellular. So you're going to generate water, ATP, and ATP is that molecule we use to make energy. It's the only energy producing molecule in all of biology. So every animal we've ever known can only use ATP to make energy. And then the third thing is CO2. So it's made it's made with any physical movement or any metabolism, really. It doesn't have to be physical movement. And then it comes out of the cell and goes in your bloodstream. And this is why we can test bicarbonate in your blood, and we have a pretty good indicator of actually your acidity, if you will, right? Like if you're super alkaline or super acidic. Sodium bicarbonate's a good metric directly of that. If CO2 tolerance, like it's the same shit, right? Like I like getting it actually as a tolerance measure. I like getting it as a blood marker. Well, when you start getting that, CO2 levels start to rise. That's what gives you the desire or feeling like the sensation that you need to ventilate, you need to breathe. So when you start exercising, you start ventilating more, because not necessarily the demand for more O2, but really the demand to rid yourself of the increased CO2. Well, that's also the same thing happens when someone's experiencing anxiety. They're overventilating because what's happening is they're increasing the CO2 concentration in their body, and they want to just dump it. And so you just start to naturally, and then you'll start to realize like that's not a very good breathing strategy. So you'll go, because that little gas was when you're actually getting oxygen in to exchange. The rest of it is just CO2 dump. So you can imagine then a situation when you're trying to be as relaxed as possible and you're trying to actually detach from consciousness, where you're breathing that CO2 back in. Every physiological sign inside your body is going to be screaming at you like, dude, something's going on. Oh my God, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. And we'll very routinely see this happens. If you're at home listening, think about yourself. Like if this ever happened to you where you're just exhausted and you get in bed and you're like, your eyes are burning, you can't wait to sleep. You close your eyes and within seconds, you shoot right back awake. That's a very, very classic sign of CO2 issues going on, because everything in your body is screaming sleep, but the CO2 is going wake back up. We're in danger mode. So it's hitting you in the face. Like it's a fairly solvable, fairly easy problem to solve, actually, once you identify. In fact, I'll just go straight to the answer. You just have to improve airflow in your room, one way or the other. You have to be careful, though, because heat and air conditioning can also cause a lot of problems. So one of the things that the Absolute Rest system, that's the name of this company, by the way, Absolute Rest, we actually also measure particulates in the air, allergens and the amount of dust and stuff in the air. So if you're kicking on your heater at night, or your air conditioning, and that's moving a bunch of allergens and particulates that don't agree with you into your air, that's just going to make you're just trading one problem for another. And so that's why, like, if you really want to guarantee these problems are solved, like we have to, like, we can solve it. I guarantee it. It just may cost a tremendous amount of money. But that's the CO2 cloud situation, is make sure airflow is really optimized. And that's can depend on everything from the setup of your mattress in your room to having a simple fan on that just moves some air, or whatever. So
yeah. So stay on the CO2 topic, Andy. Could we go into what you've seen as the best needle movers to improve somebody's CO2 tolerance?
yeah, it's the SAID principle. SAID principle is specific adaptation to imposed demand. In other words, if you want to grow your bicep, do a bicep curl. I don't really care how many reps that, like that's just, you have to do a bicep curl, period, right? If you want to get better at writing, you have to write. The specific adaptation is a reflection of the imposed demand. Practice holding your breath. Practice letting CO2 build up. That's as simple as it has to be. If you want to do that by exercising, fantastic. If you're not an exerciser, that'll work. If you are an exerciser, you're already getting that stress, so that's not going to probably do much. So now you need to do something like a practice breath hold. You can do apnea. I'll give you two resources. Okay, so if you go to Shift Adapt, I think it's shiftadapt.com.
Yep.
You can look up their CO2 tolerance test. Follow the directions, enter your score, and it will give you a specific breathing practice to do based on your CO2 tolerance score. So it could be what's called cadence breathing. It could be box breathing. It could be triangle breathing. It could be apnea breathing. So depending on how high or low your CO2 tolerance is, some of those are more appropriate than others. Another thing you can do is go to the XPT Life app, which is fantastic. In that app, it has a similar thing. It has a couple of different breathing tests you could do for CO2 tolerance. Inside of that, it'll also give you a whole bunch of CO2 tolerance building specific routines. So I like this because you can just open up the app and be like, basically help me improve my CO2 tolerance. And it just has guided breathing things that just walk you through it and you don't have to do anything. So those are really good places to go. If you want something where you're like, you just like walk me through the process. If not, I'll give you a real simple one right now. A box breathing routine or a triangle, it doesn't matter. Where to start at like 5 seconds, which means inhale for 5 seconds. I'll try to do as much or all of these through your nose only as possible. So inhale for 5 seconds, hold that for 5 seconds, exhale for 5 seconds, inhale or hold that for 5 seconds. So it's a box, 5 seconds top, 5 seconds side, 5 seconds box. If you've looked into box breathing and all, it's simple. A triangle is the same thing, but you cut out one of those holds, right? If you do 5 seconds and you repeat that, say 15 times, you're like, that was super easy. Okay, then make the box a 6-second box or a 10-second or a 12-second box. Find that place where you're like, oh man, this is really, really hard. Just like exercise, like you want it to be hard, but not like just unbelievably hard, but you don't want it to be so easy either. So find that place where you're like, this sucks a little bit, but okay, I'm getting better.
Are you using HRV as a measure of physiological recoverability?
Yeah, we do. Readiness is depends on the athlete we're working with, but HRV is okay. There's just some real significant problems with it, but in the right person, in the right environment, we will use it. So some of the professional athletes, they like it a lot and it can be helpful. In fact, I'm giving a talk at the NFL Combine in a few weeks, and I'm talking kind of on that topic specifically. So I was working on that this morning. With HRV, you have to start at the very top, which is number one, first question asked, did you collect good or bad data? In other words, sometimes you wake up and your HRV is way off. Occam's razor says, let's go with the most plausible, simplest explanation first. So instead of jumping to, I'm physiologically shot, I'm blah, blah, blah. Like, did you sure that the strap was on right? Like, are you sure that it wasn't just like the kid woke up in the middle of the night and said, like, okay, you're probably not physiologically toast. You're okay. Bad data. Let's assume it's good data. Okay, great. And the next question is, all right, what phase of my programming am I in? In other words, am I peaking or am I adapting? So if you're in a phase where you're in competition season or you're trying to physiologically peak that day, that's different than if you're trying to induce adaptation. So if it's the induce adaptation phase, then I'm probably not doing much with a low HRV score. I don't really care, right? I'm going to continue my training session as planned. I'm going to do my work schedule as planned. It's fine. In fact, most people won't even really notice what it feels like. Let's say it is. But let's say you're like, oh no, I need to be performing fantastic today, whether it's sport or just like, I got really important shit I got to do work today. Fine, whatever. So you're competing, you're peaking right then. The next question you have to ask yourself, is this acute or chronic? A single acute day of HRV or whatever your readiness metric is, by the way, I don't give a shit about. There's so many ways I can explain it to you that it doesn't matter. Even bad, like a single bad night of sleep has almost no physiological bearing. It doesn't matter at all. It will not change maximal physical performance or mental performance or anything. What you really care about are 5 to 7 days strung together. So we're looking at big trends. So with our HRV data, I have it going back 4 to 5 years on some athletes, and we can start to look and go, okay, what do you typically look like in January? What do you typically look like week 2 of your season? And I'm seeing, whoa, your average HRV is really low compared to what now. Okay, something is happening differently now. But just like a day or two in the tank, I don't care about. I'm not making really any changes whatsoever. Maybe some very mild ones, but like I'll probably just try to like, all right, we're going to do a little bit more aggressive warm up. We're going to play some louder music today, like, or we're going to do something fun real fast, whatever the hell needs to jump you out of it. We're going to do a competition before. We'll do weird shit like, okay, we're doing our conditioning first today. We're just gonna flip it around, just have some fun, like whatever the hell the thing is. You're just like, it's just a state shift. You just kind of break the pattern. I might do some specific food stuff. Like I might give them a comfort food, or we might give them like, I might do the opposite. Like, no, we're not gonna eat breakfast today. Why? And we'll play some stupid Cameron Haynes meme or a Jocko talk. And we'll just be like, we're gonna have some fun. Like shit like that'll snap you out of a bad HRV day, right? Whatever it is the athlete does. So you kind of have to just coach, right? And do the same thing to yourself. I love for like business people. Ben, I know you know Tony Robbins. He has this really wild shit where he'll just like jump up and down on a little tiny trampoline and just like scream and scream and scream. I love it. Like I love it for business people. Like you'll be surprised. You just like do some jumping jacks and just fucking put some headphones in, put it to 10 and just scream. Like it'll actually change real fast how you're feeling. It's super effective. As like kooky as it is, I don't think it's like the best thing to do every single day, although it's not bad or anything. But you can pull that trick out and like it'll change how you're feeling right now. And I promise you, if you then go back and relax for 20 minutes, check your HRV is just right back to gold.
Right.
If it's none of those things, and it is now chronic, and we're supposed to be peaking, now we have to play some different games. But that's how we treat anything that falls into the readiness score, whether it's our force velocity data, whether it's any internal or physiological measure like HRV, or we'll do blood work daily and urine work daily on some of our athletes. And so some of those numbers are off. We look at all those things.
Are you drawing a correlation between HRV and CO2?
Yeah, often. Yeah, very, very often, especially if they're mild to moderate. So if you check your CO2, I'll put it this way. What I like about CO2 is it is much more representative of subjective. So what I mean by that is like, and they do a CO2 tolerance test and it's terrible.
Right.
Like very rarely does that happen, but very often they're like, I feel crappy. CO2 is in fact crappy. So it's not as often as they feel terrible and their CO2 tolerance is actually outstanding. HRV misses that sometimes. So you'll see a lot. In fact, it takes the buy-in from a lot of athletes out because they'll be like, I feel great. Or the opposite, right? They're like, I feel terrible. And so they're just like, this thing sucks. Like, well, that's why you can't just throw everything into one of these things because, there's a lot of things that go into your subjective feeling of the day. So we do try to tease out how you just feel because like you got yelled at this morning or whatever versus like you're physiologically actually strained right now.
Some people could feel low or feel great, have low HRV because of cortisol, right? Maybe they have just a healthy cortisol spike. Maybe they drink a cup of coffee and they're fired up. As
an athlete, you know that there's days where you just like, man, you feel everything is off, but then you actually start training and you're like,
great,
what the hell? And you just like hit PRs or you get like really, there's a fine line between listening to yourself and also then this convincing yourself, like, just do the work.
How much are you looking at individual variances from a perspective of the nervous system? So like someone may be born with a sympathetic nature, someone may be born with a parasympathetic nature. And how much are you looking at that from a context of how you design a training routine?
I don't think we have any actual metrics for that. So you can certainly, I would say, broadly categorize people in terms of what that means, why it matters, and what to do about it. We don't have anything that I'm aware of that we could measure and then objectively do things differently with. The only thing I can say we can do on that respect is actually look at outcomes. So if you're simply not getting an outcome, an adaptation that we're looking for after a while, then we can go back and say, maybe we're misaligned because you need more, you need less, or things like that. But I'm not aware of any strong way to actually diagnose that in the laboratory.
Yes. From a perspective of like, I'm sure you've observed different, very, very different personality types, right? Someone who's super driven, super outgoing, super eccentric versus someone who's maybe a little more introverted, a little more recluse. That's kind of what I'm looking at. Are those, there's no way that you're approaching those differently from a training perspective? You just don't see a difference?
I don't think so. I don't think we've ever really needed to put into place any different routines, with the one exception. If we go back to that snapshot quadrant model, we're trying to make sure we have an appropriate balance between those four categories. So training, recovery, relationships, and business, right? Whatever that stuff means to each individual person. One thing we do pay attention a lot to is, okay, if we're not getting recovery, what are we doing for recovery? And that's when the introvert versus extrovert, or just to globally call it that, starts to really matter. So for example, if it's like, hey, you're spending the same amount of hours as somebody else on your relationships and other stuff, but actually relationship time drains you. So that's not actually a recovery thing, because you need to recover by being in isolation. Or the opposite, right? Like, hey, our schedule is not, you're not getting to go out very much and you're not getting a lot of social connection. So you're not really recovering as best as you can, because you need that stuff, more classic extrovert or whatever we want to call it. So that is something we will pay attention to. And again, if we're saying like, hey, let's try this, like, can we change it? Can we take the training down, or can we take something down? Because I need you to have more, whatever thing is that they do, to be more socially exposed or not. So that I'd say as far as we do. But in terms of like actually writing their training or nutrition or any other programs, I don't think we've seen any need to do it differently.
Let's talk about hydration, because I know that's an area of interest for you and massive opportunity for athletes out there. So you guys last we spoke using a shirt to measure sodium excretion, were you not? Is that still the same?
Well, so there's a bunch of ways you can do it. You can get small patches that can be placed anywhere on your body and measure that. So Levelin is a company that's been doing it for a long time, and she's been around for forever. Basically, they can ship you a little kit, and you can put that on your arm, collect that, send it back in the lab, and they'll send you a report. Gatorade has since come out with a product that's like $25 for 2 patches, and you can get it, put it on your arm, and it gives you basically real-time indications of the sodium content. There's some actually way more exciting and interesting tech coming that's going to be here. I think you can actually sign up for it now. One of them is called Nix, Nix, and they're not available yet, but they're taking pre-orders. And I'll say that is, I've been able to go behind the scenes a little bit with that company, and the tech involved in that is significantly better. It's a little pricier than Gatorade, not as pricey as Levelin, but it's real time and has some other really cool features. So you need to understand a little bit about what's coming out of your body, and primarily what we're talking about here is sodium. And so to back up just a quick touch, hydration is not just drinking water. Okay, like that's a surface level way to think about it, but it's also a way to get yourself in trouble. Hyponatremia is real. So hyponatremia happens when you just chug too much water. We had an athlete very recently who's, by the end of his competitions take 4 to 5 hours. And he was just like, man, by the end I get like kind of foggy brain, just like, I don't know what's going on. I try to just chug water and drink a bunch of water. And so one of the first questions I asked him was like, okay, when you get to the end, when you're done, are you peeing like pretty clear or is it really yellow? And I was interested because if he's peeing clear, then I was concerned he's maybe drinking way too much water and getting into hypernatremia, because that for sure can give you brain fog and a bunch of other problems. Well, it turns out he's like, no, like I don't even pee for hours afterwards. And it's like, oh, so then it's like, okay, now I have a salt issue. And so I can just run a very quick diagnostic to figure out what your hydration problem is, because it's going to be one of three areas. It's going to be water, it's going to be salt, or it's going to be sugar. And you got to make sure that all three of those things are what we call isoosmotic. So they're coming in at the same concentration that your blood is. If not, if you're drinking it's too dilute, what happens is your blood vessels expand very quickly. So the volume in your blood vessels gets large, and your body then interprets that as saying we have too much volume. It kicks in its natural diuretics and you start peeing out water. And so this is why just chugging water when you're dehydrated, like if you're really, really dehydrated, it's okay. But you can make yourself sick, you can throw up, you can give yourself diarrhea, or you can simply lose 85% of that fluid back in urine really quickly. So we see this very commonly where people are really dehydrated, they chug water, they start peeing, and they're like, okay, I'm better. Well, they actually haven't fixed the hydration issue at all, because all they've done is taken water, their mouth, gut, blood, urine, and it's out. And it never actually got into tissue, because that's what we're trying to get, right? We need to reclaim blood volume, but we also need to reclaim hydration into the actual tissue or muscle or organ or wherever we're trying to go. So we want to make sure that those three categories, salt, sugar, and water, are in the correct concentrations. If it's too concentrated, then you can actually kind of go in the opposite direction, pull fluid out in your bloodstream, and then you're in a bad spot. If you can simply replace the concentration of your blood with what you lost, then it's going to expand the volume of the blood vessels. It's going to have enough time for it to then move into the tissue. And we know that salt and sugar specifically pull fluids into tissue. And so that's why they are so effective at enhancing hydration over something as simple as just water. And that's what we're looking for. So then the blood volume kind of goes back to a normal level. You don't think you need to excrete a bunch of it, and you push a bunch of it into tissue. So all that preamble to say, this is why understanding what you're sweating out can be such a big deal. If you're a high, medium, or low salt sweater, then you probably want to match your electrolyte consumption or your salt concentration or whatever you're doing with a somewhat equivalent concentration. And that's how you're going to nail things until you feel the best the longest time.
Can you talk about those numbers, Andy? So what is parts, how many milligrams of sodium per liter or whatever? Is there a calculation that's typical for making an isotonic with the blood?
Yeah, you can do that, but unless you have a sweat patch, it's not going to matter. You're not going to know. So I'll give you the easier version. Because any sweat patch you get, it's going to come and it's going to tell you exactly the amount of milligrams. I'll put it this way. They're going to actually measure sodium. And then from there, since we know the molecular weight of sodium and chloride, and just to maybe make this really clear, salt, like table salt, is just sodium chloride. Okay, 1 part each. But the molecular weight of sodium and chloride are different. And so you can't just weigh them equally. It's kind of like a fancy chemistry thing. So what's happening is with any of these metrics, they're just going to measure sodium, then they can infer chloride. Like you typically want like a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 potassium to sodium ratio. So you can kind of just run some quick numbers on that and get close. I think that the easier way to think about concentration wise is look at the color of your clothing. And a hat is the best example. So if you ever see somebody who has a hat and they just have like white crusty stuff over, or if they wear like a bandana or something to work out, then that typically means they're a very high salt sweater. So that's a really quick way to figure it out. You can taste it, honestly, like you can wipe it. It's kind of gross, but like just taste it a little bit. And you're like, wow, that's really, really, really salty. The other way you can figure out is sweaters. So you know how some people, you just like, they just start moving or whatever. They walk in the gym, they get dressed and you're just like, you're just pouring in sweat. What the hell? So those things can be visible, and calculating your sweat rate, in other words, how much you're sweating is really easy. All you have to do is weigh yourself naked, go do whatever you're going to do, dry off completely, and then weigh yourself naked again. So let's say you lost 2 pounds and you worked out for an hour. Then it's very easy to figure out, all right, you lose 32 ounces per hour or 32 per 60 minutes. divide that too. It's a pretty easy calculation to figure out. If you want to use the cheater version, you can just take your body weight divided by 30, and that's going to tell you roughly how many ounces to drink per every 15 minutes or so. If you want the super cheater version, it's typically like 5 to 7 ounces every 15 to 20 minutes or something. It's like a pretty close number. If you want to go to different electrolyte sources, the majority of electrolytes you're going to get. So this is Noon. This is one of my favorites. It's called Scratch Labs. It's really fantastic. Element, LMNT, like right on the front, it tells you it's 1,000 milligrams. That's one of the higher ones. Cerulite is fantastic. There's a bunch of really good ones, but most of these are going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 400 milligrams of salt per serving. So what we typically do is I kind of branch them into low, medium, and salt. So if you want to get like and you can just look at Noon and Liquid IV and like all these different ones. And the lower end runs are going to be in that 200 to 300 milligrams per serving. The moderate ranges are going to be 500 to 700. And then those ones at the top, like Element, are 1,000 milligrams. So really, or 1 gram, that's kind of the same thing. So you can kind of think of it like that. You can also just try. So just try a day with kind of one from each category. And then just figure out like which one makes you feel best or worst or not. And then the last thing to kind of think about this is hydration during competition is a little bit of a last straw. So you're much better taking care of it the day before and several hours before. So worrying about it during or after you're dehydrated is a bit of a losing bet. You can do some things, but you're really kind of catching up. So if you are a whole foods kind of only or almost exclusively type of eater, then adding a lot of extra salt is probably going to make you feel better because you're just not getting a lot in your natural food. So of course you're putting some salt on your food, you're cooking it, but you're eating real whole foods. There's not a lot there. You're probably getting 300 milligrams a day in your food, maybe something like that. Like the normal RDA and stuff recommendations are more like 2,500 milligrams per day. You're probably in the 2,000, 3,000 milligrams per day, like normal. Like that's a pretty good kind of number. A lot of folks do better higher though. They just do. What gets people into problems is if you eat a lot of processed food, you could easily be getting 7,000 a day, like sometimes 8,000. You can go because one meal might have 2,500 mgs in it, right? Is there a high end?
Is there a high end of that? Because I know Dr. Dino Antonio says like 10 grams a day. Do you know him?
Yeah, 10 grams a day, dude. It's all context, man. Like if you are 48 years old, you're 35 pounds overweight, you got a little bit high blood pressure, you don't exercise, you have a hard job. Like if you're at 10 grams a day, you like could be seriously dangerous. That's really fucking problematic, most likely. If you're 32 and you see the sun and you control and you do all these things, you eat with whole foods, like you might feel great on 6,000 milligrams a day, maybe 7,000. I don't know. Like if you're lean and you're training a lot and you're sweating a ton in and out. So the entire sodium picture matters a lot is kind of why I started this thing is if you're eating a lot of processed foods, you probably don't need, no offense, Rob, but you probably don't need 2 or 3 element packages a day. In fact, that might be detrimental, right? That's just a ton of fucking salt. Yeah. If you're, really conscious and you don't consume that many things and you don't, here's another thing too to add. You're drinking 2 or 3 sodas a day. Well, you're just way crushed on salt. But people who live kind of lifestyles more like we do, like you just don't have any salt intake other than what you put consciously on your food because you're drinking only water and teas. And like there's just no added preservatives and salt or any salt-like material in anything. You're probably fine having a couple of those elements and going up an extra 2,000 milligrams a day. In fact, again, you might feel really, really good or a lot better with them. So the thing of salt is context matters. Entire salt intake and outtake. They matters a lot to whether it's like you're going from this was a performance enhancer to this is like very detrimental to your health to I just kind of was out of it and didn't feel great.
And I know you're in charge of all physiological parameters and training guidelines for your athletes. And I'm curious, how much you guys, if at all, are paying attention to body composition as a marker of performance, right? So is it just kind of like a side effect of proper training that they get in good shape, or do you actually do some specific body composition training?
Yes. So that is one of our visible stressors. Well, there's a lot going on here. Okay. So depending on the sport, it may or may not matter. If you're a basketball player, it's probably in your best interest to be like quite lean, right? Because you're just absorbing a lot of extra force, jumping, running. You don't want to be excessively lean, but for a bunch of other problems, that's not the interesting part though. If you're an NFL player, depending on your position, it may or may not matter really at all. If you're a power lifter trying to break, so it really depends on the sport and the individual we're working with, whether we are somewhere between like moderately to massively concerned. From a health perspective, that answer is different. It is a big, big, big concern because we know the role adipocytes have in regulating physiology. It's not simply about the weight or the visual. It is about what those cell types can do and what processes that they are involved with that has our concern for global health. So you don't need to be under 10% body fat, but you start getting past the 30% marker and higher. And we've had plenty of people kind of in our executive programs that look like that. And it becomes a real physiological consequence. It becomes a real problem. The cytokine storm that can come from that can be quite nasty. So yeah, we're gonna track that for some folks. So do we go and put together programs to reduce it? Again, it depends on if it's a real need or not. What we generally try to do is, if we can correct your physiology to getting you closer towards that true physiological potential, body composition tends to just take care of itself in large part. So it tends to just move when we get the system happy. It just tends to take care of that in some part. Now, in some part, then we have to just go very specifically put you in a caloric deficit and all other things. But a lot of times we can move the needle 3 to 5% in terms of absolute amount, but by just getting some physiology corrected. You start sleeping better, and testosterone goes up. We just had an athlete come back this month, double testosterone, no pharmaceuticals at all, nothing like that. And like, oh, geez, body composition got better. We didn't change calorie intake really at all, but obviously caloric output went up. And so body fat sort of dropped and muscle mass went up because of the testosterone and these other things. So yeah, sometimes a lot, sometimes not much.
What's your greatest passion within this context? Because there's so many things. Is it just like the optimization of the system? Is it all of it put together? Or is there one specific facet that you just find yourself being pulled to?
I think my answer would be that it is 100% not one specific. I think that's probably the thing is I don't like, this is why Dan and I work together so well. He likes really kind of staying in that lane. And I hate staying in one particular area. So if you look at my CV and my labs, you're just like, your shit, this is all over the place. Like, yeah, that's just how I love it. Like, I love it that way. So I think I'm attracted to that. The fact that there's just so many avenues to go down. And, I feel like every year our systems just go leaps and bounds up and up and up. And our capabilities are going there. And some of the new stuff that we have, we're working on, it's just some really cool shit that it's so far above and beyond what I ever thought I would ever be into from a performance side.
That's amazing, man. I love it. Andy, I don't want to take too much of your time, man. That was incredible, hugely valuable. We could probably keep going for another 2 or 3 hours, but I want to be respectful. I'm not sure if you want to offer a point of contact for our listeners, some of your social media. Where can they reach out to you or learn more from you?
Yeah. I guess Instagram and Twitter are the best places. Of course, the YouTube page has the most education. Like all I do that is on my YouTube page is put my university lectures and stuff on there. So education wise, that's the best place. I don't have a fantastic landing. I'll put it there. You can just go to my website. Just my name, andygalpin.com. And then I think that on there somewhere is like a contact thing. And I will for sure get those emails if you ping me there. That's probably the best place.
Now you're back in the lab doing some research, or are you pretty much still out of that?
We're still we're not in a good space yet there. So it's gonna be probably a handful more months, hopefully, and then we can really get. Technically we're allowed back in, but it's just not feasible yet. So
hopefully by the summer. Forward to getting back in? Yeah, looking forward to getting back in, or has it been really a blessing that you're out of it?
Well, both, man. Like it's been a blessing. We've been able to build, this absolute rest stuff and stuff with Dan, the biomolecular athlete program would have never happened without some of these times away. But I'm also super jammed to go back in and finish some of our intermittent fasting and hypertrophy stuff and some of the other muscle stuff we're working on. Yeah, man, science is fun as fuck. So I can't wait.
What are you working on hypertrophy wise?
So we were really, prior to the pandemic, we were close to 3 years into an intermittent fasting and hypertrophy. And we were maybe 2.5 weeks away from finishing that whole trial. And, we got shut down and I begged. I was like, I swear, just give me 2 weeks. And it did, obviously, I had to pull the plug there. So we want to get back in and finish that study. And then,
what was the hypothesis on that one, Andy?
Well, we don't have any hypotheses going in. In general, what we were trying to understand is, okay, I'll say this a couple ways. I'm interested in a different type of science than I was earlier in my career. This study was a nice example of that. So the study in particular, we were interested in, this is a collaboration between myself and Menno Henselmans. If you know Menno. Yeah, great guy. And there's a lot of interesting stuff with intermittent fasting, but what we were curious about is what about the other side? What about people who are trying to actively gain as much muscle as possible? You're trying to go through a growth side. Like, does it help? Does it hinder? Does it not matter as long as protein and calories are equated? Like, is it irrelevant? And so that was the real purpose of it. So we had, multiple groups and they were matched for total calories and timing and training and everything, full supplementation and sleep and everything was matched. And one group just got all their calories in an 8-hour window and one group got it in a 14-hour window. So we were really close. Those are training studies and we had our last cohort in and they were all 8+ weeks into the training and just needed a few weeks to finish and post test. And so we lost those. But the representation of it, the type of science I'll be doing going forward is I'm no longer interested in siloed stuff. So I don't want to do any more studies, nothing against this, but I don't want to do more studies where you do an entire 10-week training study and then all you measure is who got stronger in the squat. That's great. I mean, that's fine. Like I still have some interest in those, but because I work with humans, I'm more interested in understanding what's the pro-con map of this. In other words, okay, so say the intermittent fasting was better for muscle growth, but people had a 40% increase in digestive problems. And they had, they lost sleep quality and they reported hating it. That's an important piece of information for people to know. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe they said this was actually easier, my sleep's better, but I gained 3% less muscle. Or a lot of people might be like, well, I'll take 3% loss, but my digestion, whatever. Like, I don't care how it landed for any of the metrics, but I think that stuff is what people really care about. They want to know, how's it going to affect my happiness? Is it sustainable? Yeah. How much of it? And so our studies actually all of our measures have all those in them. It's no longer just ultrasound muscle biopsy, like, oh, we're trying to be more comprehensive in the things. So we have sports psychologists on board, sleep scientists on board. We had microbiome on board. So we're taking stool samples and running full analyses in collaboration with some microbiome laboratories, not like, commercially available stuff, like actual true. That's the type of stuff I'll move back to when we get the lab going is, so we can just say, hey, look, like, because science is really bad about being like, it worked or it didn't. or it's true, it's false. And that's very difficult to find in real life. It's more of like, here is the confidence interval. It's likely to do this in most people. It's also likely to do that. And
where was that study leaning with what you did?
I don't know. First of all, I couldn't tell you ethics wise. And number two, I don't know. It's just actually this study is triple blinded. So I'm 3 steps removed so I don't even have access to the data. It's all like locked, and I won't look at anything until the entire thing is done. And then I'll look at all of it. And then I won't even know the groups until it's actually then unblinded past that. So
you'll have to go back and redo the whole thing.
No, we'll just need to finish the last cohort. They'll have to restart again. It'll take us a long time we have to go back and redo a lot of the calibrations and validity and like all this stuff and make sure that and then we'll redo the cohort. So
what's one of the most interesting research papers you've come across, either yourself or somebody else's, that was maybe, contrary to what you previously believed?
Oh shit. I mean, God, then you're talking 50% of my career or more. I mean, there's few things that I don't know, like I don't know what the percentage would be, but the percentage of things I've changed my mind on is far higher than most people would realize. I could go into so many areas, like all the breathing stuff I thought was hot garbage. Initially, all the gut microbiome stuff I thought was hot garbage. I thought all intermittent fasting and keto was all hot garbage initially. I thought sarcoplasmic hypertrophy was nonsense. I thought, I changed my mind entirely on the interference effect and concurrent training and aerobic exercise with hypertrophy. I mean, there's just so many areas that I've, this is stupid to now. And then I was like, oh, maybe now I'm like, oh yeah, okay. Just a lot of times it's like you're partially right. Yeah. But you were still pretty.
I think as a good scientist, it's very important to have a healthy degree of skepticism, which it sounds like you have since the beginning, and you've just been willing to have an open mind as well. It's the way I approach life. I say I'm an open-minded skeptic. I think it seems to make sense as a scientist.
I did this giant video on my YouTube called Bulletproof Bullshit Detector. And my goal was to walk people through how to understand and think through complex ideas. And so the way that I will express this is there's a relationship, right? And everyone is somewhere different on this gradient. And on one end of the gradient are the flat earthers and the folks that no matter like anything that comes up that's different from the narrative, they jump all over and then they're 100% certain, right? And so they have tremendous certainty combined with limited information, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you've got tremendous certainty with tremendous amounts of information. But there's a little bit of a false premise here because sometimes we have too much certainty in the face of like what we think is tremendous information, but it's just never actually been clearly established. So let's plant the flag here, and we'll do this and then we'll wrap. We've got the flat earthers on one side of the spectrum, and on the other side of the spectrum are water is made of H2O. Right? Okay, great. So if somebody came to me and tagged me in a post or sent me something of like, hey, did you realize like H2O, water is not made of H2O? I'm not gonna spend a millimeter of time on it because that has such an extraordinary claim that has so much evidence behind it. You would need so much equal evidence for me to even consider paying attention to it. So I'm just going to ignore it, right? There's only so many hours we have in a day. I'm going to ignore it. On the other end of the spectrum, I'm also ignoring, right? Just like, okay, there's nothing here for me until you come with tremendous amounts of evidence. Now, some people live kind of in the middle of the spectrum. I'm like, well, okay, I need a little bit of evidence, swing my way, blah, blah, blah. I'm probably hedged more towards the right? Like I'm generally not going to act until I see a lot of information. I'm slower to move. I'm behind the curve a lot, but I want it to be that way. Your government, you want to be even further down the line than me, right? You want the government to make decisions very slowly. You want them to really, in fact, you want them to only be making decisions about things that are really concrete. The rest, like, it's not our job. Like, we're only going to give you things that we are just for sure on. Practitioners and gurus and folks, they're going to go way to the left of that spectrum with me. And they just don't really take any information or intuition or small piece of information, and they're going to go all over it. But we need those people too, because not everyone in the world can wait for someone like me to change my mind. You are sick right now. You need things like you. So we need people across, and we need systems and institutions across all of these spectrums. We need that, right? Because we have innovation and help and progression from all parts of the spectrum. You just simply have to understand where you are personally on that, and then the person who's giving you recommendations, where they are. And as long as we're having honest dialogue about that, then I'm totally fine with it, right? So if you think that putting your bare skin on the earth improves the ions in your body and your energy gets better, like, I don't give a shit. I'm not listening to that at all. Maybe I'm wrong, just like I was about some of the things I just talked about, but I don't really care until I start to see some reasonable evidence on that. And when that evidence comes up, I might go, oh shit, great. It's just not something I'm going to take action on yet, because you're so far removed from evidence. Fine. But someone else wants to do it. I don't care. That's great. I'm not going to call them a shit, fucking snake oil, whatever. I'm just going to be like, that's not my personal interest level right now, because the evidence hasn't hit my threshold for action.
Right.
Yeah. But people's threshold for action is different levels. It's just, as long as we're honest about that and we're not selling the foot in soil like it's the same effectiveness as a high grade pharmaceutical. Like not to say one's better. I'm not more like pharmaceuticals better than. Now, I have a book called Unplugged. Like, I'm generally like, I want you to beat that far in the equation. My point is, though, is like, we're just having honest conversations. Like, here's where I am in the spectrum. I tend to take action very quickly, and I don't need a ton of evidence, blah, blah, blah. Or I'm super slow. So just because you doesn't make me better. Like, none of us are better than anyone else, because there's different problems that require different solutions. It's just a false representation. That's the only thing I give a shit about. So acting like things are grounded scientific shit when they're only from cell culture research, or they're only from a yeast model. And then, in fact, there has been science to show that that's not actually going to transfer to humans. And that's the type of shit where I'm like, you're a pile of shit. Like, you had an idea about what happened in yeast. We ran trials on humans. It didn't work at all. And now you're still just ignoring that and hiding that from people. That, to me, is that's a problem. So anyhow, I don't even know. I don't remember how we got here, but that's where I'm at.
Helping Dr. Andy Galpin. It's always a pleasure. I hope you'll be back again soon.
Yeah, man, anytime.
That is a wrap. Ladies and gents, thank you very much for being here. I am your host, Ben Pakulski. As always, incredibly grateful for your ear, incredibly grateful for your time. I realize that you have so many options to choose from, yet you continue to come back and choose the Muscle Intelligence Podcast. And we do our best to bring you the best curated guests in the world when it comes to understanding high performance. The way I explain how I choose guests is I want people who begin where everyone else ends, because I think that's a really great way to see really pushing the possibilities of human performance. That's where we learn. When you stay inside a box, maybe in a box of self-limiting beliefs, or a box of what you think everyone else thinks is accurate, or what everyone else thinks is effective, then you live in this box and nothing ever changes. And this tends to be a very big part of the world of fitness, is people tend to just go, oh, this worked for the guys in the 70s and 80s, so let's continue to do it. And that's just not interesting to me, right? I want to find people who are pushing the realms. And I always say that people who are successful have one foot on the other side of discomfort. And Dr. Galpin is absolutely someone of his caliber. He's always pushing the boundaries of what's possible while keeping an open mind to really everything that's out there. I suggest each and every one of you guys do that as well. I'm highly skeptical of everything and everyone, but I also want to explore and listen and hear and have a greater understanding. And the future podcast guests on this episode are very much in that realm. People who are truly pushing the realm of human potential and human possibilities. So I hope that excites you as much as it does me. If it does, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else that amazing podcasts are subscribed to and listened. Have an amazing day and live your greatest life in a body that you absolutely love.
Thank you so much for tuning into Muscle Intelligence. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to share it with at least one person you know. And make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Ben Pakulski and the producers, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical problem, consult a licensed physician.